Okay, so we've, in the overview interview that we did, we talked a lot about millix and Tangled and kind of how it's this fully decentralized set of services across this protocol. But when we talk about decentralization and Web3 and all these buzzwords that fly around, and it all sounds really good, but at the end of the day, there are governments that can exercise their control over the choke points, which are still out there, right? Which are namely domain name services, DNS, is the big one, and just sort of like their control over the top level domains that the planet uses on the internet. So, like for instance, like if some government didn't like a millix user's social media page and wanted to shut it down, effectively they could, it would be pretty heavy handed, but they could, go to the top level domain of DNS and, effectively, co-opt that address, within DNS and shut it down. Right. So how in the world can this, ecosystem between millix and Tangled, how can we solve this? How can we keep these services running in a fully decentralized fashion such that nobody can take you down and censor your content or your voice, right? What are some ideas that we're currently working on?
When we were talking last time, I had a kind of a throwaway statement that my friends that watched the video kind of universally asked me, what were you talking about? We knew that as we design a social media site whose only content policy is what's allowed by US law and disregarding the content policies of every other country, we recognize that the response to that could be countries shutting us down. And I said, and we're working on a solution for that too. And so let's talk about that. I had an experience maybe a year ago where I saw a news article, and I won't mention too much of the details, but the story was that the administrator of a top level domain, and it's the one that everyone knows and uses, and the administrator of that is a government that everyone knows, they had co-opted and shut down a website. And what it means when they shut down a website, it means that when you go to that website, you're greeted with an official symbol of the government that says, the government has taken control of this website and it's no longer available because some reason. And in the case of this story that I read, the reason was that the content on the webpage was untrue. That was it. And you can imagine the slippery slope of that. And I'm not talking about the government of a banana republic. I'm not talking about a government run by a despot or a dictator or a fascist kind of government. I'm not talking about one of those. They would be much more incentivized to do what this government that I'm talking about did do. And I thought that we probably needed a solution for that.
Okay, so let me understand, what we're talking about here, right? If governments can, basically co-opt a website or a destination on the internet and shut it down, using DNS and top level domains. So what's our answer? I mean, how do we get around DNS? I mean, are we talking about decentralizing DNS somehow? I mean, what's the answer?
Yeah, we're not just talking about decentralizing DNS. And by the way, here's what DNS is. When you type in a domain name in your browser, the internet doesn't work using names. It has to translate that name into the IP address of the server that has the content for whatever URL you put in. And so DNS translates a word into a domain name or a URL into an IP address. That happens on a really small number of servers. There's a really centralized aspect to DNS, which makes it run very fast. So there's DNS, and then there's also these top level domain names, and everyone knows what a top level domain name is. They just don't know what the word top level domain name means. What it means is .com, .org, .mil, .fr. It's the dot something at the end of a domain name. That's something .org. Org is the top level domain, and that's also centralized, and generally is centralized at the government level. So we're talking about that, and we're also talking about domain registrars. So the companies that you go and you look to see if a domain name that you're interested in is available, and you pay $10 a year, and you have kind of the right to use that domain name that you paid the registrar to use. And that right is manifested in something called an A record. The A record is where the IP address of the server that hosts the content. That's what the right is. You never own a domain name. You're just basically renting the privilege of pointing it somewhere to a server.
Right. Right. And these DNS servers are like giant lookup tables, right? So Microsoft.com translates to a certain IP address, and that's, oversimplifying a bit, but that's the sort of information that lives on a DNS server, right? And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And you could count the DNS servers on two hands, the important ones.
Mm-hmm. And they're owned and run by governments.
I'm not sure. I know that there's not many of them, so they're centralized, right? I know that they're centralized. So the challenge is, and this is important for, this is important for not just content, but this tsunami that everyone's talking about DeFi. Well, the DE in front of the FI stands for decentralized. And this wave of decentralization could potentially affect every aspect of the human condition that occurs online. That's a great objective. The problem is that you can't run a decentralized service that's behind or dependent on centralized components that are required to get somebody from to the service. That's not decentralized. DeFi is not as decentralized as everyone thinks.
Yeah, they're decentralized in name only, right? Because at the end of the day, those, it's not to, I won't name any or pick on any by name, but yeah, a decentralized DeFi exchange, that's still a website it's still running on server hardware that's hosted somewhere.
Yeah, you have to
right?
find it.
These aren't peer-to-peer. Yeah, and you have to be able to find it to use it. It's not a peer-to-peer, BitTorrent network, right? It's residing on the internet behind domain name services that can be blocked, right? So it's really, it's decentralized in name only, right?
Yeah.
So they're susceptible, to takedowns and takeovers.
Yeah, right. And it's not it's not just somebody who wants to kind of participate in the glamour of DeFi because it's the hot thing right now, that it's a great kind of objective for mankind to strive towards. It's also every single Chinese citizen who's trying to live their life behind the Great Firewall, who can only access the content or the experience that the government allows them to. And to the extent that people feel that freedom of speech is a human right, not a sovereign right, and to the extent that people think that property rights are a human right, not a sovereign right, if you're in China, you can't. There's property that you are prohibited and forbidden from owning, cryptocurrency, to name one, because the small number of people that run that government feel that owning cryptocurrency undermines their best efforts to control the economy. in an unnatural way. So we needed to come up with an end-to-end decentralized system.
And so what does that look like? What does that answer, or the partial answer, the solution that we're coming up with, what does it look like? Have we, you've begun to kind of sketch out a solution. How does it work?
Yeah, so step one is the Tangle browser, because people don't understand all of the activity that a browser does. They just think that they're putting in a URL or an address, and magically content is showing up on the page. But there's all these machinations happening behind the scenes to make that experience easy and fast. And because we write the code for the Tangle browser, we can have it behave in different ways than traditional browsers do. And everyone, and I apologize if this kind of becomes a nerdy conversation, but people are generally familiar with HTTP : some domain name or URL. HTTP and HTTPS is telling the browser kind of what network protocol you're asking it to use to go out and find the content that is on this web page that you've asked for. Well, we can replace that. We can substitute HTTP with tangled : some URL that you want to go to. And by doing so, we can bypass all these points of centralization. We can bypass domain registrars, we can bypass DNS, we can bypass kind of the big monopolies where content is hosted, where their policy, in addition to the government's policy, decides what can reside on their servers. And that was the goal, and then we just had to figure out technically and tactically how to do that.
So then are you saying that millix will then need to kind of create and store kind of our own lookup tables of millix addresses, that people want to have stored and be routable or findable through a Tangled browser, right? So is that the solution path we're headed down? Yeah.
One of the other things we talked about in our previous conversation was storing data on the DAG, and how kind of the easiest way to visualize that for most people is NFTs, which are generally at the moment a JPEG or something visual, but it can be anything. And an NFT can be a word, like a domain name word, and then the IP address of the server that word is meant to point to. That's an NFT. You can only have one combination of word and IP address, and so it's a non-fungible token. It's a one of one. And if you can do that, and you can, as you call it, this lookup table that's matching a name to an IP address, if you can store that in a decentralized way, if you can then have the browser know that if you're not using HTTP : you're using tangled : then the browser knows not to look on the normal DNS servers to find the content you're looking for, but instead to look for a particular TXID on the millix DAG that has the IP address of the server where the content that you're looking for is hosted.
Okay. That makes sense. And it sounds pretty straightforward, because at that point, once you have an IP address, you're really, to get the content you want, you're just, traversing the network. You don't have to use DNS name services to figure out what that IP address is any longer. So you just get routed to where you need to go, right?
And there's nothing to be taken down or hijacked. There's in that environment, there's nothing to stop you from the content or the service that you're looking for, regardless of what country you're in. And it's, if I was living behind the Great Firewall in China and I wanted to access a site like Facebook or a site where you're not allowed to go, whatever that site is, the kind of the obvious first step that most people would consider is just to use a VPN service and to get through the firewall. And I wouldn't trust that. I wouldn't trust, because VPN services themselves are centralized and they're subject to subpoenas. And for all you know, the VPN service in China that you're, or wherever, that you're using to bypass the Great Firewall is actually owned and operated by the Chinese government. You don't know. And to the extent where the consequence is life or death, that's not a gamble that you want to take. And I'm not, you know, there's all kinds of use cases for this, but in my mind, I'm not talking about content, finding content through centralized points when they've decided to take them down. I'm talking about human rights. I'm talking about the right to free speech and the right to property.
And what about, you know, just to play devil's advocate a little bit here, but you know, if we've kind of now figured out a way to not need the DNS services, okay, great. Now you have an IP address that's routable. Wouldn't a government be able to say, you know, to the ISP that manages the, you know, the connectivity of the endpoint to that endpoint of that where that IP address is, couldn't they say, hey, ISP, stop routing to that address, just take it out of the table, it's no longer routable? Isn't that a potential outcome here?
Yeah, a government could still figure out the IP address of the server that's hosting the content, and they could take action on that. And that's a harder problem to solve. But if you have a decentralized, call it a decentralized DNS for lack of a better word, if you have decentralized DNS, then you can rapidly change the IP address that content is hosted on and that the word or the name is being pointed to. And for the time being, that might be kind of the best solution to a difficult problem.
Right. So at that point, I guess what you're saying, what I hear you saying is kind of like, well, yeah, if it's really important content, maybe it lives in, you know, multiple places, or it could be changed to different IP addresses. So then you're engaging in a giant game of whack-a-mole, right? And the government, yeah, you know, you can play it endlessly, right?
There's a potential solution that we've kind of tossed around, but we haven't. The potential solution is that instead of having the web page hosted on a server that's using an IP, you have the web page, the content of the page hosted in the transaction on the day, and that will never get taken down. The problem, the big problem, and that's a great benefit, right? The cost to get that benefit is that it's not as easy to have web pages and websites that are dynamic with using data, using account data, like being able to log in and check against a database for credentials and things like that. That's another hard problem to solve, but it would not be difficult to host static data, static content within the DAG that cannot be taken down because it doesn't live on any server that you can go attack.
Got it. So, you know, what it feels like a little bit to me here is, you know, life imitating art, right? I mean, you know, I don't know about everybody watching this video, but I certainly was a big fan of, you know, the Silicon Valley TV series. And, you know, one of the, you know, story arcs that pervaded throughout the seasons was, you know, what Pied Piper was trying to do was rewire the internet, right? And create the, you know, completely decentralized internet. And like no kidding, it kind of feels like that's the path and the solution that's being built here, right? You know, a completely decentralized internet, in effect, powered by, you know, ultimately, you know, scalable cryptocurrency and protocol that, you know, will pay people who participate in that network. It just feels like, that's it's almost like you built what you saw people kind of joking about on TV, but here it is, it's coming to life, and it's being born, and it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm a great fan of Silicon Valley, and I saw the show, and maybe it was in the back of my head, so that when I did have that experience with content being taken down, um, it didn't stop me from thinking that there was going to be a way to do it, and so we had to put some thought into it. But yeah, this is one of those here we go kind of moments. The train is leaving the station.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. It's really amazing, and yeah, it's just super exciting to see what's being worked on, and being rolled out. And let's see, we'll be able to put it back in the bottle, right? Hopefully not, right? Hopefully this works, and it really takes over, and provides those basic human rights, as you put it, to everybody on the planet.
Yeah, and hopefully, as we're kind of expressing these ideas, many of these ideas are prototype. They're not even beta. They're prototype. But to the extent that these ideas resonate with people that see these videos, or that hear about the ideas, hopefully we attract a community of developers with their own ideas of how to use something that's truly decentralized, peer-to-peer, with no centralization at all. It opens the door. I can't wait to see what happens.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Price.
Thanks, Rick.